This is the Uncollared Podcast, off-the-cuff conversations between progressive pastors at the intersection of religion, politics, and culture. I'm Todd Leonard. I'm senior pastor at Glendale City Church of Seventh-day Adventists. In a moment, I'll be joined by Shane Kinnison, senior pastor at First Baptist Church of Glendale. Today, we're going to reflect on the relationship between police and communities of color, as we've seen fresh evidence and we're reminded of previous stories of how people of color are mistreated at the hands of the police at a much higher rate than white people are. So I hope you enjoy the conversation as Shane and I reflect on this continuing problem in America. All right, it's good to be back with you, Shane, after a few weeks apart, and I'm missing Galen. Galen's not going to be able to be with us all the time now, but hopefully you and I can have a good conversation today. And I know for both you and I, we've been really focused in on really the police's relationship with the African American and minority communities again, as we've seen the shooting of Dante Wright, as we saw the shooting of that Latino teenager in Chicago, and then now is the trial of Derek Chauvin, the Minneapolis officer who put his knee on George Floyd's neck, is wrapping up here in the next day or two. We just want to kind of spend some time with this today and share our reflections on what's been happening over the last couple of weeks. And Shane, you were talking to me earlier, and I thought you had some interesting thoughts related to African Americans' relationship with the police.
Well, it is good to be with you today again, Todd, and we are missing our friend Galen. We wish him best, and it's nice to see that you have the Hawaiian suntan that you obtained during your most recent vacation, and I hope it was a wonderful time.
It was. Thank you.
But it is good to be together, and we cannot help but reflect and discuss what's going on right in front of us as a nation, as the trial of Derek Chauvin, the police officer accused of killing George Floyd, is literally winding down on television today with closing statements. And the most recent, one of the most recent police shootings in just these last few days, Dante Wright, in the same vicinity of Minneapolis, in that larger area, and watching that unfold on television in front of our eyes, and then some of the other incidents that you have mentioned, we can't help but acknowledge that this is happening in real time, and it seems to be increasing in front of us exponentially. And I don't know if you feel the stress over that. I'm sure you do, but I feel the stress of that as well. And I think our nation is under an inordinate amount of stress and strain regarding the situation of violence against people of color, particularly by those who have the authority to carry it out. And let's talk about that a little bit today, if we can.
If anything, what the events of the recent weeks have done is revealed that as much energy and passion as there was last summer in the protests around the murder of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, and all the good that those protests did in that short-term time, we've got to understand that what we have laying before us is all the evidence that we need to say this is the work of generations to try to get this right. These things are not going away from even an extended time of protest that we had last summer. Systems are so opposed to change by nature. Any system that's been in place for any length of time resists change. And we clearly have systems in our government and our policing that are just fundamentally resistant, even without any human bigotry or racism attached to it. Just institutionality by its nature is resistant to change. And so unfortunately, for those of us who are desperate to see change, for our brothers and sisters of color, we've got a lot of work ahead of us that will be the work of a lifetime if we're going to put our heart and soul into it.
Absolutely. And I like the way that you have described that as that multi-generational, multi-layered approach. You think about where we've come from since the leadership of the civil rights movement and Dr. King and others, and then wonder where we are in our current scenario, in our current national relationship with one another, our current national politics and national structures, as you have very well said. And you begin to ask the question: have we made much advance? Have we made many strides? And as Dr. King's book would say, strive toward freedom. Have we really striven that much, even after our loss of his life in violence and tragedy? Are we at a stalemate? Are we spinning out of control? Are we stuck in the mud or high centered? Or are we actually seeing various degrees and levels and kinds of progress? So something for us to bear in mind. One of the things I've seen on social media is a saying that went sort of like this. Forgive me, I don't have it quoted particularly. But it basically said that after all of these years, the most dangerous place for a person of color is still within the imagination of a white person.
Wow.
The most dangerous place for a person of color is still in the imagination of a white person. And just think about that for a moment. The idea that the imagination or the thoughts of a white person, I thought it was my apartment. I thought he had a gun. I thought he was going to attack. I thought my life was in jeopardy. I thought he was going to rob a house. I thought.
Yeah.
And you bring that to light in this most recent killing of Dante Wright, where the 26-year veteran officer responsible for training new recruits yells over and again, taser, 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 and shoots Dante Wright with her issued revolver, and then says, "Oh, I shot him. I think I shot him."
Yeah, that statement, Shane, the most dangerous place is in the thoughts of a white person. That speaks volumes, and that speaks directly to the officer who shot Dante Wright. And it we I think there is something inherent in me. I'm not even gonna place it on anybody else. I'm gonna say I think there's something inherent in me from my racial background and my upbringing and my life experiences that I am more prone to see a person of color as a danger to me than I am when I see another white person. And that is a horrible admission to make. But I don't think we are going to get anywhere until white people can admit that about ourselves and consciously pay attention to that and then look at the training that will have to be done for first responders who are making decisions about people's lives, not just police, but medical first responders, fire first responders. How do you respond to a person in danger who is white or a person who is in danger who is black or Latino? How do you respond in those situations? And we just have so much evidence that white people get the benefit of the doubt
Mhm.
in all these split second decisions, these life and death decisions. And so there has to be a so much work of retraining our our instincts to start viewing things differently and give people of color the benefit of the doubt like we do to white people.
Well, we saw on footage within just a matter of hours or days of each other the incident where Dante Wright was shot and killed by a 26-year veteran police officer over against the traffic stop of the person of color in military uniform
Mhm.
who was being pepper sprayed in his face by local law enforcement and eventually was dragged out of his vehicle and thrown onto the ground and did not ever do anything wrong. Not one single moment did he do anything wrong
Yep.
except be where he was at that moment in time. Everything about those scenarios can be connected back to, as you've indicated, to action, action that is always rooted in thought, and thought that is always rooted in emotion or feeling, an emotion and feeling that is always deeply rooted in subconscious bias. And so you can connect those dots all the way through in any scenario that we have witnessed in these days. Actions come from thoughts. Thoughts come from emotions, and emotions come from deeply seated biases or biases. And so you want to take it and make it personal, as you have just done. And that is what I deeply appreciate about you, is your sense of authenticity and transparency. Each of us, you and I, each of us have those biases, those implicit, deeply embedded, enculturated, family oriented, community oriented senses that lead us to have various kinds of emotions and thoughts and actions when we approach or when we encounter either something or someone or some group. And we're responsible for that.
That's right. It is our responsibility. It is not the job of other people to adjust their behavior. And yet we know that African Americans have worked hard to try to show themselves as gentle, as friendly, as kind for their own survival. They have tried everything they can, and that's one of the things that has been said, over the last few years in relation to the police brutality is that it doesn't matter what you do. It can be Dante Wright trying to flee. It can be the officer, the military veteran who did everything just as he was asked to do and supposed to do, and he's still going to get pepper sprayed. It doesn't matter what posture, what facial expression, what type of clothing that a person wears. A black person is going to be judged as a threat much more quickly than a white person. And no, they have tried everything they can. They, for their own survival, they have taught their sons and daughters when they get pulled over by the cops to make sure their hands are on the steering
Yes.
wheel at 10 and 2 and to have their driver's license and registration ready in their hand. They've done everything they can for their own survival, and they're still getting killed and harassed at much greater rates than white people are. And so they've done everything they can. It's now on us. It's our job. It's our responsibility.
Absolutely. Um, I don't know about you or those who might view this or listen to this podcast, but I can say out of my own frame of reference and memory that in my formative years, as I was driving and becoming more independent, I do not recall having one single significant conversation with my parents in relationship to how I should respond to law enforcement or any person in authority who would stop me in an action like driving, crossing the street, even walking up and down the halls of the school. It was just a known, it was a known, accepted reality that if I encountered law enforcement, it would be okay.
Right.
If I encountered school administration, it would be okay. If I encountered county government, it would be okay. And my mother and father did not have to navigate me through all of these scenarios of this is what you do if this happens, this is what you do not do if this happens. That never even entered into my arena of thought. So that shows you what the window into my
Yep.
subconscious bias,
Yep.
so that you can see further into who I am as a human being. I lived in a fearless position toward those who had authority over me, and it was a respectful position. It was a position that was both fearless and respectful,
Mm-hmm.
and I was taught that that would work well for me, and it didn't have to be repeated.
The biggest fear I had with being pulled over by the cop was figuring out whether or not I would, if or would be getting actually get the ticket, or if I would be able to figure how to get out of the ticket and somehow give an explanation or an excuse that would fly with the officer. That's the worst I had to worry about, was whether I'd actually get the ticket or not. The idea of a gun being pointed at me never has entered my mind, uh, and never will. I have nothing to worry about when I'm pulled over by the police for speeding. It's probably I'm being pulled over because I am guilty of speeding, and I will get a ticket, and that will be the extent of it. And I never will ever have to worry about anything. I've recently had my daughter's had a car broken down on the side of the freeway. We've had officers pull over to help us. One stayed with us for an hour while we waited for the tow truck, and just being helpful and wonderful throughout the whole process. And that is the typical interaction that I, as a white guy, have with the cops.
So now the burden is on us, as you've indicated earlier, to become even more cognizant and more honest and transparent about those subconscious biases that we have,
That's right.
and bring them forward into the light and illuminate them in current reality, so that we can not only assess ourselves, but we can begin the process of making culture and community better for everyone by honestly and proactively having these conversations that lead to attitudinal change. And the attitudinal change has to start in each of us.
Well, I think related to this, Shane, this has popped up in my mind with the recent events. It's come back to me again, and I know it's a little further back, but it was such a watershed moment in our country to look back at the insurrection that took place on January
Yes.
6th.
Yeah.
There was clearly a different expectation
Mhm.
and approach to the Black Lives Matters
Mhm.
protests of summer of 2020,
Yes.
and the large gathering of mostly white people who gathered
Mhm.
on January 6th to listen to Donald Trump. And
Oh,
so even so these biases, not even in a split second decision like when somebody is resisting arrest, but even in the planning of how you handle situations, there
yes.
was there was somewhere, even if, and it probably was never even vocalized by anybody, it was just in enough subconsciouses that there was a lot less likely
Mhm,
chance of this large group of mostly white
mhm,
people doing violence
mhm.
than they were concerned about when they interacted with the protesters back in the summer that were mostly people of color.
Absolutely. And that's even now, I believe, been further documented in these, last months and weeks gone by, where it's been shown that there was a lack of preparation, a lack of concern, a lack of ramping up for this consolidation of Trump supporters, who mainly would be white people, coming onto the nation's capital. It's not like we didn't have dress rehearsal.
Right.
Look at Michigan and other state capitals where armed militias, armed to their teeth, carrying assault weapons of all different kinds and flares and brands, coming into state capitals, actually taking over rotundas and different
Yep.
places within those buildings. It's not like we didn't have a dress rehearsal.
That's right.
And then to watch how gently, calmly, and receptively these armed militias were encountered by law enforcement, by government officials and government agency leaders, and those who had the power, the authority, and had even the reason to put them on the ground, handcuff them, take their weapons away from them, and put them into jail. So we had plenty of dress rehearsals leading up to
Yep.
the great insurrection on January 6th. And it just and our community of colors kept standing and pointing and saying, look, see for yourselves. What's the prosecution saying to the jury today? Believe your own eyes.
That's right.
Believe what you see in the videos. Believe what you see and hear in the testimonies. Our communities of color were pointing at our state capitals in that period of time leading up to the insurrection, saying, "Look, look, look." And then when the insurrection happened, our communities of color were pointing again. Look at what did or did not happen based on who was gathering on the front steps of the United States Capitol.
That's
That's
right.
pure bias within itself, played out in actions that led to almost the imminent overthrow of democracy for the first time in the United States history.
Yeah. We betray ourselves. We when we don't recognize that even our prefrontal cortex, as powerful as it is, and as powerful as it is to influence the decisions that we make, it is still governed by the feeling center and the instinctual fight
Yes.
or flight center at the back of the brain. And though I would guarantee you, you go down the list of the law enforcement who are involved in things, they do not think they would treat people of different races differently. Well, maybe their prefrontal cortex won't, but their feeling center and their flight and flight center in the reptilian brain betray them, and they betray us.
Yes.
We have to recognize that we are governed by deeply animalistic instinctual behavior around this,
Yes.
and it actually has to be verbalized in any discussion of planning that takes place, of any training and preparation for people who are engaged in high stress situations. You have to, I think you actually have to verbalize and lay it on the table in any significant decision making event so that you can say, all right, this is what we're planning to do. Now let's talk about the race question. What are we missing
Mhm.
if this was a different group of people or a person of a different color, what would we be doing
Mhm.
in this situation? Have we been planning all this with a person of color in mind, or have we been planning all of this with a white person in mind? How are we going about this? And what would we do if it was different?
Mm.
Um, I think that it has to be that blatant for us, and we can be embarrassed about it, we can be ashamed
Yes.
about it, we can regret that we have to do it, but I think it has to be that that blatant. This is so hard for us as white people to admit, but we're the problem. It's not black people who are the problem when it comes to this. We're the problem. We're the ones who are doing this.
That's a very powerful commentary, and one that will have all kinds of barbs, um, based on who hears it and receives it and how they respond to it. It's very powerful. Thank you. I do appreciate what you said about the brain, from the the prefrontal cortex to the feelings to the reptilian brain that guides us instinctively. I think I would like to lay on top of that layering of movement, whereby it begins with ignorance. If I don't know you, that means I'm ignorant of who you are. Ignorance then is the bedrock that leads to fear. Now that instinctive part of my brain is beginning to kick in, right? So I have ignorance that leads to fear. And my fear, if it's not quelled, my fear, because of my ignorance, leads me to hostility. Something happens between the two of us, and I become hostile toward you because I'm afraid of you, because I do not know who you are. I don't understand you. I don't I don't resonate with your background, or your accent, or your skin color, or whatever it might be, but I don't resonate with you. So I become hostile. My hostility leads me then to anger and hostility. I become angry, and my anger leads me to violence.
Mm.
And violence, if not checked, will lead me into paths of destruction or even death, either destroying you and killing you, or destroying myself and being
Mm.
killed in the process. So this idea of ignorance leads to fear, which leads to anger and hostility and resentment, which then boils, and over time in that cauldron it boils, and then it overflows into violence, and violence leads to death and destruction. I think this is what we're seeing in real time on our nightly
Mm-hmm.
news and our Twitter feeds and whatever it is we follow. I think this is what we're seeing. Overlaying that on top of what you said about the brain itself, all of that. And then along with that is what Dr. King warned us against so many years ago, when he warned us that we were becoming incapable of exercising critical thinking as a people.
Mm.
And without critical thinking skills and critical thinking ways of living, what do? We knee jerk react back to our instincts. And we use our instincts every time.
We are a culture that is, we are defensive and back on our heels with our dander up all the time, and there is no ability for self-critical thinking. We are happy to point out the problems with everybody else, and as even as we have said these things today, I hope people have understood that as we're criticizing things, both you and I, Shane, have said that we're talking about ourselves first. That this is not something that's out there for us. I mean, we're not in the law enforcement business, but we have benefited our whole lives in the law enforcement context because of
Mm-hmm.
who we are.
Mm-hmm.
And if we had chosen the career in law enforcement, we would be behaving in very similar ways.
Mm.
with unless we had been self-critical. We have to beg people, can can I be part of the problem? Am I a human being with dark as well as light within me? And when I say dark and light, I'm obviously not in the racial context, but in the good
Yes.
versus evil context. Do I have that potential for hostility and for hatred and for violence? Do I have that within me? And can we admit to that
Hmm.
and say I have to be vigilant
Hmm.
about that in how I behave towards others?
So, how do we launch this conversation into wider frameworks of those who would be willing to have it along with us? Um, what do we do with what we're sensing, what we're seeing, what we're feeling, what we're struggling with? Um, not only in a sense of our despair, but also in a sense of our hopefulness that
Mm.
surely there is a beloved community that Dr. King envisioned and spoke about. Surely there is a beloved community that is already existing here among us and can continue to propagate and multiply. How do we address all of this in our sense of despair, which leads us to shame and humiliation and embarrassment, and our sense of hopefulness that
Mm.
leads us to those better angels that authors have talked about in the past?
Well, and I think for you and I, Shane, in our local context, we're seeing some of this happening in the Coalition for an Anti-Racist Glendale that we're involved in.
No.
You're, I know that you've been part of conversations with where the coalition has met with Glendale police and
Yes.
has started conversations, which I think is uh, courageous and right where we need to be having doing work. Um, and then I think, in the context of our congregations, using those passages of scripture that that really highlight what God calls His people to be. The story of Jonah
Mhm.
and mindset that he had about people he had considered his enemies, and
Mhm.
how God opens him to start seeing people who were his enemies as his own. And in the Christian Gospels about the story of Peter and Cornelius, and Peter viewing this Roman uh, military officer as an unclean pagan, and God reveals to Peter that in fact, no, he is the Son of God, just like you are, Peter, and filled with God's
Yes.
Spirit, just as you are. And I think we have to continue to have those very specific and blatant conversations with our congregations, who we all within our congregation still carry much of that unwillingness to do self-reflection, despite all we say about confess and repent our sins.
Back to that idea of, could it be that the most dangerous place for another human being is in my thoughts? Could it be that the most dangerous place for another human being, particularly a human being different from me, is in my own thoughts and my own imaginations? I think that resonates with what you and I both have said with one another today about this idea of the power of the brain, the power of the thought process, as well as this movement of ignorance that leads us all the way to violence and annihilation. What happens in the recesses of my thoughts that would cause someone else's life to be in such danger? A thought in its most powerful and influential form is when it becomes an attitude and an action. So, what needs to change about my thought in order to change the way I act, respond, behave, and react toward others?
Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. We'd love to get your feedback at uncollaredpodcast@gmail.com. You can find our podcast anywhere you get yours, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. You can also watch our podcast on YouTube. And please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.